All right, young scholars, Mr. Martin here. This is a quick flipped classroom. Civil liberties, the right to bear arms, the Second Amendment. There's a couple cases um, in the College Board that's going to require us to study the Second Amendment a little bit more heavily. It's a really fun, interesting topic of study, as are all these cases. But again, you've got an amendment to the Constitution, the Second Amendment, which actually, in fact, was part of the Third Amendment. The Second and Third Amendment, there was the right to bear arms, then no quartering or soldiers. But the founding fathers thought it was a little bit too complicated, so they actually bifurcated it and broke it up into two. So the right to bear arms is that the common national, state, and local gun laws. And the Second Amendment has been used to restrict owning and carrying handguns, background checks, limiting the sale of certain type of weapons. This is a hot topic issue, especially in today's political climate. There's requirements that guns be stored in a fashion to prevent their theft or so children can access them. The courts have usually upheld most of these challenges. Okay, background checks, limiting the certain types of sales of weapons. So we're going to be looking at some cases here. There is the Militia Clause of the Second Amendment, which many advocates of gun control argue that the Second Amendment applies only to the right of the state to create militias. So given the fact that we have a police force and a state militia, the Second Amendment is covered, and therefore people are not required or do not need to own a gun. But then there's others on the more literal side of it, is that the government cannot restrict your right to bear arms. And if you think about it, again, this stems back to the American Revolution. And in fact, April 19th, 1775. What was the King of England trying to do? His army was trying to march on Lexington and Concord and disarm the colonists. So there is the ingrainment of guns in American culture is profound, and I don't think it's one that's going to just change overnight. One of the cases we're going to look at D.C. versus Heller. That was in 2008, and we're going to look at some other Second Amendment cases. So two of the most important Second Amendment cases that are going to be on your AP exam, there's D.C. v. Heller in 2008, and then there is McDonald v. Chicago in 2010. And we're going to read those opinions and briefs. So because of the increased urban crime and protests of the assassination of the 1960s, Congress passed the Gun Control Act of 1968, along with other anti-crime bills of that year. And really, there wasn't a big challenge in the 1960s and 70s. But then the gun debate comes to the forefront after Hinckley shoots Ronald Reagan. Because then you have a question, well, who can buy guns? Because Hinckley was mentally ill. And so this kicks off a pretty big issue. And as a result, Congress attempts to pass the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act. It's not passed until 1993. So think about it. You have a man, the president's press secretary, James Brady. He was one of the men wounded. He was shot in the head at close range. But it's not until 1993, almost 11 years after the assassination attempt, that this law is passed. And this establishes a 5-day waiting period on purchases of handguns and allows a cooling off period. So anyone who's, motivated, maybe you had a fight with a loved one and you run out to the store to buy a gun, well, you have to wait at least 5 days. You have to get a criminal background check. So the law actually expires in 1998. We'll talk a little bit about this when we get to the legislative part of our class. It's what's called a sunshine provision, where laws can be passed, but they can also expire. So this law expires in 1998, but a new law is written. It's called the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. And that goes into effect, which is kind of a replacement of the Brady law. However, this law has several loopholes, including the fact that private gun collectors can avoid background checks when purchasing firearms, in particular gun shows. And the federal laws in 28 states allow juveniles to purchase long guns, rifles, and shotguns from unlicensed dealers. So the national check system has an insufficient database and also allows non-felon criminals, domestic violence offenders, and people of mental health patients from buying guns. So there have been more laws passed to restrict the purchase of guns locally. And in this instance of DC versus Heller, we had an issue where the individual right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in the militia. And the Supreme Court ruled that the use of an arm for traditional lawful purposes can be used for defense within the home. You are within your right. And this nullified a District of Columbia law. So we are going to look pretty carefully at these two laws, DC versus Heller and the McDonald case. In addition, you have the Lopez case, which is not so much a gun case, but a commerce case. So we'll be looking at these pretty intently. If you need to go back, again, not a whole lot of content in this because we are going to dive into the gun debate a little bit more in class.